Hello! This week we're going to be doing our annotation charts on something called narrative structure.
The common narrative structures are the three types: linear, nonlinear, and interactive. This is just an overall glimpse. We're going to go into more detail on the next few slides. In general, narrative structure is about manipulating time, so either looking ahead in time, stopping time, looking to the past, mixing up the timeline of the way things happen, speeding things up, and slowing them down.
So we're going to start with the first one, linear. A linear narrative just generally unfolds in chronological order. Think of it moving in one regular line. So progressing from one stage to the next in sequential time order. We just have this example, Jerry Spinelli's book, Stargirl. Maybe you've read that last year. Now, it does say generally in order because, yes, sure, sometimes there might be a flashback or something, but overall, if the story is going in mostly chronological order, then we just consider that linear. Most books, novels are going to adhere to that structure.
The next type is nonlinear narrative, and this is when the story unfolds out of sequential order. It can be a bit disjointed at times. So one example that you guys should be pretty familiar with is The Outsiders. At first, you may not be aware that it's a nonlinear narrative because it seems to go in chronological order, but when we get to the end and realize that it was actually told out of order because the end circles back to the beginning, then we realize that it is in fact a nonlinear narrative. The Book Thief is another good example for those of you who read because it's told way out of order. And I know that if you've read it, you probably realize that it was a little bit confusing at first, but later when the scenes come back into play, it becomes clear that it's just out of order. So think about the overall structure of the book when you're looking at these narrative types. So for this narrative, it's more than just having an occasional flashback. It has to be the overall structure is totally out of order. Sometimes it's used in order to mimic human memory. And some really cool movies use this technique because it can be really creative. And as I already mentioned, sometimes it can be a little confusing, but by the end, when you look at the text as a whole, it can be really cool.
The third type of structure we're going to talk about is interactive structure. And we have this picture of the Choose Your Own Adventure books that maybe you read as a kid. We actually don't see a lot of this in literature or movies where the story unfolds according to the reader's choice, and you as the reader have to make choices that would influence the plot. Going back to the Choose Your Own Adventure series, originally it was created for like 10 to 14-year-olds. The books were written in second person, meaning it said things like, you do this, you pick up this, you put down that. Like you would become the protagonist, the private investigator or the mountain climber or the race car driver or something like that. And the stories are formatted so that after a couple of pages of reading, the protagonist, you, the reader, faces 2 or 3 options. And so you would have to choose, like, if you want to do option 1, then go to this page. If you want to choose option 2, then go to that page. And so it has different possible endings. But that's like the only book series that I can really think of that does that a lot. Maybe some of you have other books that do that. In gaming, the narrative or the story of the game is maybe one of its most appealing aspects. Video games can really be having a cool storyline to them, and a lot of times the user has to complete some sort of objective or task before the narrative can continue, and it's really neat. So a lot of times we see this interactive structure in video games. Probably won't see it a lot in literature, but we wanted to let you know about it.
So just to recap, the 3 common narrative structures we're learning about in 7th grade, even though there are some more, are linear, nonlinear, and interactive. Within each of these narrative structures, there are common literary devices that are used by authors. So we're going to learn about 4 of those: foreshadowing, flashbacks, parallel narrative, and epistolary. These 4 common literary devices can exist within any of the narrative structures that we've covered.
Starting first with foreshadowing. Here's the definition. It's a warning or indication of future events. Most of you have a good grasp on that, but here's what we want you guys to get better at. When you come across foreshadowing, you've really got to pause and ask yourself, okay, what's going to happen because of this? The author is begging you to notice it. Please don't just notice it and move on. You need to notice it and then spend some time thinking. This is a big one, foreshadowing, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on it right now.
So here's an example from chapter 2 of The Outsiders. Ponyboy says, I really couldn't see what the Socias had to sweat about. Good grades, good cars, good girls, Madras and Mustangs and Corvairs. Man, I thought, if I had worries like that, I'd consider myself lucky. I was wrong. So at the time, you may have picked up that this is foreshadowing for what happens later on in the story. We know, because we've read the entire book, that at first, Ponyboy thinks that the Socias have nothing to worry about, great lives and no problems. Later on, we find out that that's not the case, and regardless of who you are, everybody has problems.
And here's an example from The Outsiders as well, from page 79. This is when Ponyboy and Johnny had run away to the church. So it says, "I was smoking a lot more there than I usually did. I guess it was because it was something to do, although Johnny warned that I would get sick smoking so much. We were careful with our cigarettes. If that whole church catches on fire, there's no stopping it." Now, looking back, it's so easy to see that this was foreshadowing, that they were going to maybe drop a cigarette, which could start a fire in the church. At the time, I wonder if any of us actually caught it, though, because it was such subtle foreshadowing.
Here are some foreshadowing types you can look for as you read novels or watch movies. You definitely don't need to know the types. You just need to know to watch out for foreshadowing in general, and then to do the follow-up thinking that goes along with it.
So let's take a look at the first one, pre-scene. Take a look at this example. We are in the cockpit of an airplane. The plane hits turbulence, and the captain struggles to regain control. It doesn't last long, and everything is soon seemingly fine again. But the reader implicitly understands that this is going to be anything but a trouble-free flight. Basically, a pre-scene is simply a smaller version of a larger scene to come. A scene like this isn't significant by itself, but it does imply that something more spectacular is waiting to happen right around the corner. In fiction, unlike in real life, everything happens for a reason in a book. Every cause has an effect. If the reader of a novel witnesses an event that fizzles out before anything dramatic happens, you know to expect something dramatic to happen later on.
Using irrational concern, here's an example. A teenage girl leaves the house for an evening out with her friends. Her mother makes her promise to be back before midnight. The girl kisses her mother and tells her she worries too much. She'll be fine, she says. In the real world, mothers worry over nothing all the time, regardless of how old their children are. It's kind of part of being a mom. In fiction, however, there's no such thing as irrationality. If a character worries, the reader should expect that these worries are for a reason. If this scene were to happen in a book, you could predict that something would in fact go wrong because the mom wouldn't be worrying for no reason.
Our next one is narrator statement. When Ruth Jones's alarm clock woke her at 7 o'clock that morning, she had no idea that today would be the longest day of her life. The foreshadowing there's nothing subtle about that. We should notice that foreshadowing and have some sort of reaction, like maybe we'll make a prediction or we'll get excited because we know we're about to read something with action.
Next is showing the reader an object. So in this example, an old man is sitting at his desk looking at his stamp collection. When he opens the drawer for his magnifying glass, his fingers brush against a revolver. He finds the magnifying glass and closes the drawer. So after reading that, you may ask yourself, hello, are we going to talk about the fact that there was a gun in his drawer? It seems to have been mentioned so casually, which might seem odd, but if you stop and think about it, maybe that was done on purpose as some foreshadowing. Little objects, a gun, a bottle of poison, maybe an important letter. One small object that's mentioned can really mean something really relevant if you stop and think that perhaps it could show up again later. The absence of objects, too, can also be important, those same objects that I mentioned. If something should be there and isn't, perhaps that's more significant than it may seem at first.
Prophecy. So there's 3 examples here. Maybe when a fortune teller looks into a crystal ball, she closes her eyes and crosses herself. Or when the protagonist reads her horoscope, it promises a troubled week ahead. Maybe a man goes downstairs for breakfast. He sees that his lucky horseshoe has fallen off the shelf. To many of us, those types of things, crystal balls, newspaper horoscopes, those are meaningless to some people. But as a reader of fiction, I know that there is no such thing as meaningless in a novel. That has to be foreshadowing something.
And finally, symbolic omens. So here's the example. The first thing Mary saw when she pulled back the curtains was a solitary magpie sitting on the fence. She waited for a second bird to appear, but no magpie came. So first of all, just so you know, a magpie is a bird. Any reader who knows the magpie rhyme, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, I don't know if you've all heard of that, but if you have, you'll immediately suspect the worst for Mary because you know that's a bad omen. Even if Mary in the text is untroubled by the sighting and soon forgets about it, the reader should know that it's significant. Another example, the leaves fell early that year. The leaves fell early that year is a famous line by Ernest Hemingway that foreshadows an early death in the opening line of A Farewell to Arms. Storm clouds and ravens are also symbolic foreshadowing elements. In novels, symbolism is important. It counts.
Now we're going to talk about flashbacks, and most of you already know what this is, but basically it's an interjected scene that takes the narrator back in time from the current point in the story. Anytime you come across a flashback, you really should be pausing and asking yourself, what gaps or holes does this new information fill?
Here's another example from The Outsiders. This is from chapter 2. Cherry smiled and her eyes showed that her mind was on something else. Johnny, he's been hurt bad sometime, hasn't he? It was more of a statement than a question. Hurt and scared. It was the socias, I said nervously, and I don't like to talk about it either. Johnny getting beat up, I mean. But I started in, talking a little faster than I usually do, because I don't like to think about it either. And then after that, Ponyboy begins the flashback to explain to Cherry what happened to Johnny. So at this point, they're in line at the drive-in. By Ponyboy providing that flashback and explaining to Cherry what happened to Johnny, you have to ask yourself what kind of additional information that provided for the readers.
Like we've said, flashbacks really fill in crucial parts of the backstory, and a lot of times that's how the author reveals the big picture, little by little. And it does help to develop the character, and it sort of freezes time for a moment. There is always a why behind flashbacks. There's always a reason. Think about it this way. What kind of film techniques are used so that viewers realize that it's a flashback happening? A lot of times the filmmaker will put the flashback in a different color, so it's sort of like black and white, or it's like got a yellow glow to it, or something like that. In books, we don't have that type of element where we can change the visual or the music or something to let people know that it's a flashback. So a lot of times authors might put it in italics, or they might say something like, as I thought back about the time when I was little, to let you know that it's a flashback.
A parallel narrative is a story that follows several protagonists rather than just focusing on one main character, and it can actually include many things. So sometimes it's having two seemingly unrelated plots throughout a book, perhaps every other chapter, that eventually will intertwine. That might sound familiar to some of you reading your dystopian novels. But for the purpose of this class, as 7th graders, we're just going to use this term to refer to the idea of having more than one narrator or protagonist. Sometimes this is referred to as tandem narrative or multiple narrative.
Authors might use parallel narratives to help create a strong sense of suspense, or it might be used to show the individual perspectives of characters in a larger story and how they relate to each other. So I'm sort of thinking of the book Legend right now. It goes back and forth between Day and his perspective and June and her perspective.
Next is an epistolary. This is when epistles, or letters, journals, diary entries, etc. are used in telling a story. So the Greek word for letter is epistle, so that's where that word comes from. Again, this can include letters, diaries, newspaper clippings, emails, text messages, etc. The entire book can be made up of epistles, like Frankenstein or Dracula, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Or it can just be one piece of the book, like in The Outsiders, when the letters from Johnny or Soda Pop are read.
Coming from chapter 12 of The Outsiders, here it is. It says, "Listen, I don't mind dying now. It's worth it. It's worth saving their kids. Their lives are worth more than mine. They have more to live for. Some of their parents came by to thank me, and I know it was worth it." Hopefully you guys remember that this is a quote from the letter written by Johnny. And it was included in the book as a way to kind of bring him back from the dead, because at this point in the book he has died, and Ponyboy finds that letter and reads Johnny's sort of words of wisdom from beyond the grave. And it was a way for the author to give Johnny a voice in a realistic way in order for Pony to have easier healing later on. That was why this letter or epistle was added in the book.
An epistolary can provide unique character perspectives, it can reveal important details, and can add greater realism to a story because it mimics real life. So think back to any books or films that might have employed this device and how the author chose to include it. So there's lots of different ways, just like flashbacks, that an epistolary can be indicated. Sometimes it's in a different font, sometimes it's in a different color, sometimes the spacing is a little bit different, so you can tell that it's not part of the paragraph, but it's perhaps centered as a block in the middle of the page. So there's lots of different ways that an author can indicate that it's an epistle. This includes not only formal written letters, so it could also include text messages or emails.
To review today's lesson, first, there are different narrative structures. Linear meaning in a line. It goes in order, in time order. Nonlinear meaning it might go out of order. It gives you the end, the middle, the beginning, all sorts of things out of order. Interactive, which we said was really uncommon, might be when the reader gets to play a role in building the plot. Common literary devices, we've discussed foreshadowing, flashbacks, parallel narrative, and epistolary. The most important thing in all of these cases is to go beyond just identifying those and actually analyzing them. This week, as you are reading your next reading chunk for the dystopian books, these are the things that we're going to be asking that you choose to do your annotations on. One more connection, though, into our next learning is eventually we're moving on to our superhero writing unit. You're going to be writing a story, and we're going to ask that you actually try to employ some of these techniques. Maybe you can put in some foreshadowing, or maybe you can put in an epistolary, like a little letter or an email or something like that. Perhaps you can even try to do a flashback when you do your superhero narrative.